Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Global Action Platform Chairman and CEO, Scott Massey.
Good afternoon and welcome to the 2017 Global Action Summit. Let's start by talking about contingency planning. We thought we'd plan for every contingency. Until Friday, we had a monsoon rainstorm. Although the tent was up and all the sides were in place, no rain blew in. Nevertheless, the ground became so soaked that it was impossible to put the flooring down. Panicked, we looked for every option, for moving the tent, doing different things. Finally, our great construction and property management people came up with the idea of pallets to put on the ground and then put the floor on top of that. So we thought we had everything fixed. And then today, 50-mile-an-hour winds started blowing. So from time to time, there may be some rattling of the tent and some flapping of the sides. But we're delighted that you're here, and we're determined to make this a wonderful conversation and a great event. We really appreciate your participation. In October of 2012, Global Action Platform conducted the first Global Action Summit. We had no place to conduct the event, and so we used an unfinished floor, an unfinished floor in the Pinnacle Bank Tower downtown and the concert hall of the Schermerhorn Symphony Center as improvised spaces for the event. This one city campus where we are today was still a vision, a collection of land parcels recently assembled for development. Today, 6 years later, we gather for the 2017 Global Action Summit, held for the first time on the One City campus. It's been quite a journey. Our arrival here today marks a turning point, both as a physical and a programmatic milestone. To understand this turning point, let me share some highlights of where we've been and say a few things of where we might go. With our first summit, Global Action Platform set out on a 5-year journey to create a movement for abundant food, health, and prosperity. We wanted to build on a solid foundation of knowledge, and so during this time, we've worked with over 400 of the world's leading experts in food, health, and economics. We've convened some 3,000 corporate executives, research experts, investors, government, and international NGO leaders through our annual summits here in Nashville, our forums at the World Bank, the United Nations, and the National Press Club. Through this process, we've created a critical knowledge base upon which we can build for our future. In addition to our founding research, we also work to build a core network of cross-sector leadership committed to this mission, to create key institutional partners, and to establish a reputation for thought leadership and civil dialogue. Given the vital role of the next generation of leaders to address the major challenges ahead of us, we also wanted to work from the start to include young leaders, and so created the Summit Fellows Program as a way to integrate young, rising leaders into our work. In addition, we've partnered with the Harvard Business School on a program called the Young Americans Leaders Program, a program that annually sends emerging leaders from this community to Harvard to learn how other cities around the world are developing regional economic strategies for inclusive prosperity. A second set of founding goals we pursued focused on reinforcing shifts in the private sector investment and business practices to create shared value. In partnership with a group of impact investment funds, we launched the Global Action Challenge, and through the challenge, we have now invested some $8 million in a set of innovative companies. We've done this because we believe the private sector plays a leading role in scaling and sustaining solutions for the world's grand challenges. Of course, all sectors play a part, and collaboration across sectors is essential when dealing with complexity. But increasingly, the private sector has significant opportunities and significant responsibilities to incorporate social and environmental impacts into their investment and business strategies. In recognition of this increasing importance of the role of the private sector, we've also been pleased to partner with KPMG International to create the Global Shared Value Award. This award is the only global award presented to corporations that are actively and successfully integrating ESG impacts into their core business strategies. Through our investments in the Global Shared Value Award, we're joining forces with Fortune Magazine, Michael Porter, and the Shared Value Initiative in Boston to advance understanding and support for impact investments and shared value corporate strategy. Tomorrow evening, we'll all be excited to learn the name, the identity of this year's Global Shared Value Award recipient. Over the first 5 years of our activity, we've built tools to facilitate collaboration. And with our fantastic publishing partner, the Diplomatic Courier, we've produced 10 global reports, reaching a combined audience of 150,000 people for the published reports, and reaching an online audience of nearly 10 million people in terms of readership. By communicating globally, by leveraging technology, by making impact investments for shared value, and by mobilizing leaders and experts, we've worked over our first 5 years to move the needle toward food, health, and economic abundance. This year, 2016, represents the culmination of this 5 years of work and a pivot to a new stage of action. Our shift toward action begins with the official opening of the One City campus. With this opening, we can now in fact begin to create the innovation hub so critically needed by this region's economy. Through new programs on this campus, One City will become a living laboratory for urban solutions and the neutral platform for connecting the 22 colleges and universities of this region with global investors and global business opportunities. As we all know, the world is moving toward a state in which 75% of the world's population will live in cities. It's absolutely critical that we look for innovative ways for cities to prepare for the nutrition, the health, and the economic opportunity of that vast urban population. We hope this campus here at One City will help come up with ideas and innovations to model that. As a strategic NGO partner of Cambridge and One City, we'll be leading initiatives that build the culture of One City and the critical ecosystems for innovation, serving like our counterparts in Cortex in St. Louis, SkySong in Phoenix, Tech Square in Atlanta, and the Australian Education City in Melbourne. The latter are two projects you'll be learning more about at this year's summit. Our shift toward greater action is also marked by our work to develop a living laboratory for rural solutions in the Philippines. With our partners at the Global Partnership for Sustainable Solutions, we're moving from research to business development and operations on 10 million acres in the tropics. The project, the Caraga Initiative, will be a living laboratory for rural solutions, benefiting the indigenous people of the Philippines. Our commitment is to create a comprehensive development approach that is environmentally, economically, and socially responsible. Our commitment is to benefit the indigenous people of the region, as well as the investors, companies, and programs that become involved with us. In making our pivot to action, we're also announcing tomorrow our first major new partnership in health, called Empower Health. Excuse me. This partnership will provide scalable, sustainable ways to stop preventable health problems, save healthcare expenses, and redeploy those expenses to support proactive wellness. Thank you. That's much better. We will start with a very specific issue in the exploding opioid epidemic. a specific problem that's projected to cost billions of dollars, but a problem that can be prevented, not just treated, prevented entirely. There'll be more to announce about this tomorrow. Moving forward, we want to move more and more into action. We want to build on what we have learned and the relationships that we've created. We'll develop programs at One City to create a global innovation hub. We'll build comprehensive rural solutions that help people in developing regions and rural areas benefit from globalization. We'll take more action to identify, to invest, and advance shared value private sector solutions. And we'll use this summit more intentionally as a platform to identify and spotlight transformative innovations, joint ventures, and investments that can transform the world. We take our first steps in this new stage of our journey today. With the wonderful support from North Highlands Consulting, this summit has been completely redesigned to engage you very actively in thinking with us about the future. With the help of North Highland, we're going to be looking back at what we have learned, what we've done over the first 5 years, and how we can take that forward into the future and apply it. It's been quite a journey to get here today. From an idea and a vision for a world of abundance and an innovation hub for this community, you and many others have come from around the world to join us. We're grateful to you for all you've given, and we're grateful to you for joining us today. Together, we share a vision and a dream for a world in which each person will flourish. A world with abundant, nutritious food, mindful, healthy living, and inclusive economic opportunity. In service with you, that is a world we look forward to trying to create. Thank you so much. It's now my pleasure to introduce the chairman and CEO of Cambridge Holdings, the man whose vision and leadership and dogged commitment to making this One City campus a reality has helped us to get to this place. You can't do any of these things without great partners. And it's been wonderful to work with Jean-Claude and his wonderful leadership team at Cambridge and One City. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Jean-Claude Sada.
Thank you. I'm actually Fareed Zakaria, broadcasting from Fox News, if you think that's funny. Thank you for this wonderful introduction and a great preamble to our summit. I'm Jean-Claude Sada. I'm the chairman and CEO of Cambridge Holdings, which is principally involved in the development of what we refer to as a mindful, healthy living city. And it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you for the next 2 or 3 days. I think we're going to have a lot of fun, and we're going to be talking about some wonderful topics, really at the forefront of everything that people are doing. And I want to take a few moments to give you a very personal story before I embark on a few more facts that hopefully won't bore you too much. This development is really under the divine guide of my grandmother. My grandmother lived till the age of 102, and she lived a wonderful life. And as she was growing older and younger, she basically embodied what some people refer to the blue zone living is. And for some of you who have read about the blue zones and where people live the longest around the world, what we are emulating here is very much my grandmother's village, if not the blue zone's concepts of living. Well, when my grandmother was growing younger, it was a time when access to fresh food was a daily occurrence. She would take her friend and go down to the market, buy food, come home, freshly picked, and cook it. When the kids and the grandkids would come over, or friends, aunts, uncles, we would have a big celebration. Everybody would have a great time and stay connected. When you had to go somewhere, you walked. You had no air conditioning to blow toxins out of the materials that are so well embedded into our infrastructure of daily life, and so you breathed better air. And of course, it helped that at the age of 102, she had an 85-year-old boyfriend, which she sheepishly killed in the middle of the, well, I'm making this up. I don't know that she did, but rest her soul, she really guided my thinking. So did the Blue Zones, so did a lot of initiative that our friends and partners have undertaken over the years. And where you stand today, not long ago, used to be some 20-acre contaminated lumberyard that nobody really wanted. And our our mayor at the time had the foresight of trying to connect the growing west end of Nashville into this part of Nashville. And as the land was being assembled and the vision was getting closer to reality, we came along and pushed the process through and are helping and will continue to help make this absolute dream a reality. So what is this? Well, old age hits, excuse me. You will see if you walk around the 20 acres that all our infrastructure is finally in. This is 5 years in the making. Our streets and bioswales and lights and event lawn, which is right behind me, the stage, the watershed pond, where our entire campus will be irrigated from water that we collect right here in that pond. Our first office building right behind you is filled with innovative health and technology companies, along with some of the best Italian food this side of Italy. I promise you, get the lasagna verde is to die for. And of course, wonderful coffee at Sump. Well, aside from working and playing here, many people will be eager to live at One City pretty soon. The Shea, our first 277 unit apartment project, will be opening in January. The Shea's integration of nature, our residents' interest in self-discovery and shared experiences, and our community's sustainable ethos will empower what we call living in balance. Now, if you have time, I promise you it's one hell of an experience. Walk over to the Container Village right there and ask for Lindsay. Where's Lindsay? Lindsay's here, right there. And she will give you a virtual reality tour of our apartment project. It is the coolest thing you've ever done to me. I walked on water, and yes, my initials are JC, but I got to tell you, it is one hell of an experience to walk on water on that in that VR experience over there. So I would strongly encourage you to go see what we talk about when we talk about different way of life: circadian rhythms, well-lit places, clean materials, areas where people interconnect, where people are engaged, and where you can actually walk out of your apartment, and instead of being on concrete into a car, you're actually in gardens and meditation areas, by the pond, by the bridge. You can walk around, intersect with people of different walks in life, and have conversations that are meaningful. That you can't buy anywhere. That is the experience of One City living. So here we are, and as the old wise man would say, vision without execution is hallucination, right? So this place is about execution daily. We have this grand vision of what it can be, but every day that we wake up and every night when we go to sleep, we're thinking about how can we better enhance the human experience at One City. So here we are, building this community that we've envisioned just a few years ago, where the human experience will be like no other place. And all along, at least in the last 6 years, we have enthusiastically supported the Global Action Platform. We've applauded the work that Scott Massey and his partners have done around the world, and have provided GAP with a home from which to execute its activities, and thus it is entirely fitting that we greet you here on the 6-year milestone of One City. So this is also our first international event. We're delighted to welcome leaders from the European Union, China, I won't say China, India, Japan, Australia, the Philippines, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Great Britain, Canada, and the United States. Welcome. and to join all of you in working to create a world of sustainable food, health, and prosperity. We are grateful to the Global Action Platform for helping integrate One City into the local, national, and international communities through ongoing events like this summit, the New Tennessee University Business Showcase, and initiatives that make our campus a hub for global innovation. During 2017 alone, GAP has hosted and facilitated more than 100 community educational events and meetings to help people build the culture of this campus and connect it to the Nashville community. We also want to thank Microsoft, the Center for Medical Interoperability, and Pasteria for helping to host this year's summit. Microsoft has 100 employees right behind you there in its regional office, covering all types of industries, including consumer and retail. You will be experiencing firsthand the collaborative, energized workplace they have created in some of your breakout sessions. Likewise, you'll visit C4MI, which is a 501c3 cooperative research and development lab founded by health systems to simplify and advance data sharing among medical technologies and systems. The center also has clinical transformation space where providers can study the benefits for patients that free-flowing data can then deliver through the continuum of care, critically important studies indeed. So we salute the work of Microsoft, C4MI, TOA, Medicopy, and the Global Action Platform, and all the great organizations that populate this campus and will populate this campus in the future. As we look forward to welcoming more innovative companies and institutions like yours to locate here at One City, we share in your vision and commitment to advancing a world of discovery and connectivity, a healthier human experience, and a world of abundance. Once again, to all of you, partners and supporters here in Nashville and from around the world, welcome. And on behalf of my grandmother, thank you for being here. Thanks, buddy. Yep.
Well, our program this year falls into three major sections. This afternoon, with the assistance of the folks from North Highland, Nancy Schultz, whom I'll be introducing in just a moment, we're going to take a look backward at the last 5 years, the major findings, recommendations, the expertise, what we've gleaned from the comments and the contributions of the 400 leaders that we've engaged in our program so far. Tomorrow, we'll start looking forward at innovations and breakthrough technologies which, if they could be scaled, would have a major transformative impact on our world. And then on Tuesday, the third part, we'll engage even more with each of you to talk about how do we take the knowledge base we've created, the trends that we see on the horizon, and then form those into a path forward for Global Action Platform. To help us go through that entire process, we've been so fortunate to have the assistance of North Highlands Consulting, and it's now my pleasure to introduce their Vice President, Nancy Schultz.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Scott. I'm Nancy Schultz. I'm Vice President in charge of our Nashville office as well as our healthcare practice. North Highland is a global consulting company. We're headquartered in Atlanta, and we have 45 offices across the world in the United States, Europe, and Asia Pacific. And so we help companies define their strategies and implement solutions to drive results. So we're really excited, really appreciate the opportunity to help with this incredible summit. And what we wanted to do today was to start our team. I've got a fabulous team here today that you'll meet over the next couple days. We've synthesized and summarized the reports from the last five summits into a report that was a pre-read that you all got. And so what I thought I'd do today is start with basically going through some of the key points. I'm not sure if everybody read the report before they came. So I thought I'd start by just some of the key points within food, health, and prosperity, just to kind of get the juices going. And then we've got a fabulous panel that we're going to kind of unpack some of the key points and review and kind of have some discussion, and also we want audience participation. So without further ado, where is my clicker? Is this it? There we go. Good. All right. So first, we found, based on the reports, that from a food standpoint, there were 4 key drivers. The first one being around food, strategy, and systems. In order to feed the world's growing population in balance with nature, it requires a comprehensive food strategy and the creation of new food systems. From a U.S. and other nations standpoint, you need to work closely with governments on investment in infrastructure and agricultural innovations. And in order for this type of change to take place, it's only possible and scalable when partners are continuing to work together and coordinate and share data across these different disciplines. The second food driver was around food business models. In order to achieve a sustainable food and agricultural system, food companies need to bring sustainable sourcing to their business models, as well as new models for food safety, distribution, and nutrition. The Sustainable Development Goals offer a new framework to new businesses and government work together in order to solve the problems of hunger and poverty. From a food standpoint, the third key driver was around food, science, and technology. Food science and technology today faces a significant loss of faith and widespread public opposition. The food science sector will need to restore trust through better collaboration between academics and farmers, increased sensitivity to food safety and nutrition, and greater alignment of scientific-based solutions in food, culture, and values. And last, listening to farmers and the public will be important to effectively promote sustainability through innovation. And then the last key driver for food was around food, culture, and nutrition. The culture of food is the complex interweaving of well-being and social tradition. Consumers are demanding increased transparency on the content of the food they purchase and consume, as well as the sustainability and ethical practices of the sources and good supply chain. And last, new global ventures in food, manufacturing, processing, and production are focusing on the intersection of food, health, and sustainability. So those were kind of the 4 key drivers and key points from a food standpoint. So now moving on from a health standpoint, again, 4 key drivers surfaced from the last 5 summits. First key driver around personalization. The future of health is not in a national or universal system of healthcare, but around personal behavior and genetics. Personalized medicine being enabled by technology, shifting focus and incentives from disease-based healthcare to prevention and wellness, holistic care for patients inside and outside of hospitals, understanding a person's genetics can drive more personalization care in a cost-effective manner. And then while most Americans view medical care as a solution to their health problems, they don't understand that medical care accounts for only 10% variation in health. The real determinants of health are behavior, lifestyle, genetics, and environment. And how do we measure success of these determinants? So that was the first key driver around personalization. Second, what we found in summarizing was around innovating healthcare delivery, redefining what community means and what this means to the delivery of healthcare systems. Healthcare industry needs innovation in order to address important challenges such as reducing costs, improving health of the population, and improving patient experience. Providing an ROI on prevention and wellness enables the healthcare system to design different financial and business models. And providing well-being around the world requires new healthcare models. And then collaboration and technology will drive better disease diagnosis and treatment around the world. So that was the second driver. Third driver around health was around driving data insights. By leveraging the power of big data, and everyone's dealing with data today, the healthcare system can make better decisions on healthcare delivery and what the opportunities are that are still out there to improve healthcare. Making patient data available to the patient through single sources And we have to create a new vision for healthcare data in order to reach an abundance of information as well as intelligence. And then the fourth driver around health was around shifting paradigms. The Affordable Care Act has introduced a new paradigm for approaching healthcare delivery in America, which is focused on three components: better health, better healthcare, and better value. And then we're going to unpack that further from a global standpoint today, healthcare across the world. Because health systems, issues, and needs vary so widely between the regions of the world, elevating the level of health for every citizen to the highest possible will require unique regionalized approaches that we want to talk about for the next few days. We have to approach prevention of disease through public education. And the healthcare system needs innovation to address three important challenges: reducing costs, improving health of the population, and improving the patient experience. The U.S. spends over 90% of its healthcare dollars on treatment and cures and less than 10% on prevention. Given that nearly 70% of diseases and healthcare conditions are behavioral and environmentally driven, how do we influence more healthcare-related behaviors? So we're going to unpack that further over the next couple days. So those were the four key drivers from a health standpoint. And last but not least, around prosperity, we found that there were 6 key drivers that were distilled over the last 5 years, and I'm sure there'll be more coming. First was around economic regions, regional economies that leverage the talent and assets of their local knowledge, workforce, institutions, and capital are key to the creation of universal prosperity. Despite globally increasing poverty levels, wealth gaps are increasing alarmingly, and high growth in regional competitive areas of innovation can help economically stressed communities become part of the global economy. So the second key driver of prosperity was around clusters. Clusters are geographic concentrations leveraging the research and innovation assets of universities with local business leadership and entrepreneurs. The key to cluster development is creation of regional economics, ecosystem built on trusted relationships among research scientists, business leaders, and venture capitalists. The third key driver we found for prosperity was around ecosystems and competitiveness. Companies can improve their global competitiveness while improving their local communities and the lives of employees by creating successful ecosystems. Competitiveness discussions often focus on concerns about inequality and joblessness. The U.S. is losing jobs to offshoring and location decisions at alarming rates. Chasing low wages and supplier pricing around the world is costlier than expected, and they can prosper from investing in local businesses and individuals. The fourth key driver was around innovation. Innovation and the underlying research is critical to driving the economy and solving food and health problems. We've seen a decline in government-funded research and increased competition from other countries. Research is moving to a more collaborative model, and hopefully we can talk about that the next few days. Collaborations between government, academia, the private sector, foundations, and public advocates are growing. These collaborations are supported by regional economic development strategy models. The fifth area we found from a prosperity was around social progress and shared prosperity. The SBI was created to measure the success of social progress initiatives. One focus needs to be alignment on sustainability. Resistance by traditional business sector is still a barrier to the successful integration of complex social issues. The SPI may be used to drive data-based policy decisions and measure success. And consumers and investors need to reward companies for exhibiting socially responsible behaviors and being a source that promotes flexibility and transparency. And last but not least, the last area for prosperity we found was around capital and investments. Impact investing seeks to balance social gain with modest financial risk the increased complexity has driven companies to seek more diverse forms of investment in order to achieve returns. Due to the loss of risk, social enterprises must engage business resources to build models that demonstrate necessity, as well as organizations have to learn how to fund and market social investing through government agencies or crowdsourcing. The current lack of competition is driving collaboration and alliances. So those were kind of the key themes that we kind of pulled out of the report that you all received over the last few weeks in leading up to the summit. So now what I'd like to do is we'd like to move to our panel, and if our panel would please come up, we'd like to gauge around these key themes across food, health, and prosperity. So without further ado, I will bring up our panel. Maybe we could just sit straight across. John, maybe start here. John Clifton is with us he's the managing partner from Gallup. Trevor Davies is here from KPMG. He is the global head of International Development Assistance Services Institute. Nicole Golden is here from our Center for Security and International Studies. Chris Mallett is here, Corporate Vice President from Cargill. Innovation Research and Development. Muthoni Maru from Oxfam is here. She's our Senior Director of International Programs. Kathy Pickus is here from Abbott, our Divisional Vice President of Sustainability. And Claire Pomeroy is here from Albert and Mary Lasker Foundation, and she is President. So welcome. So our panel here is going to work on amplifying some of these key findings and insights. So what I'd like the panel to do is, if each of you would, maybe start with John, if you would introduce yourself and a bit about your background, as well as if you'd comment on how do we move beyond the silos. You know, if you think about it, we can't solve food, health, and prosperity without solving for all of them. So that's a theme we want for the next couple days, is how do we work together? And in your mind, how does this relationship between these all areas work together?
Sure.
So thank you, John.
Yeah, my name's John Clifton. I'm a managing partner at Gallup, and I'm also the managing director of an initiative known as the Gallup World Poll, where we go out into 150 countries every single year and ask people their opinion, ask them how their lives are going. I read the summary report, the 5-year summary report of what's happening with Global Action Platform, and you asked about how could we break away from the silos. And I guess I would have one recommendation. The very opening of the letter says that the report engaged 400 leaders. That's how we got all the information that we included in the report. Now, one challenge with engaging leaders is the fact that they're not always right. And if we solely relied on leaders, we would be in two different realities right now. One, the UK would probably still be in the EU, and Hillary Clinton would still be president, or be president, for that matter. You see the challenge with that? That's what happens when we engage opinion leaders, but not the people. So one recommendation that we would have as maybe a next step for the next 5 years would be to engage the people, whether it's here in the United States or around the world, on what it is that they want, and that might break up the silos.
Very good. Thank you, John. Trevor?
Hi. Trevor Davies from KPMG. I guess when I was looking at this, I was kind of thinking about what I was going to say, and I looked at the report, and the problem I had with the report was in many ways similar to John. It was a function of the 400 people who happened to attend over the last 5 years. It was a function of who happened to present, what were their pet topics, what were the areas they wanted to talk about, and what did they think was important. And because certainly for the first 3 years it was very US-centric, that meant that you didn't really get a very strong global view coming through. And I think that's really important because the title is not American Action Platform. It's not even Nashville Action Platform. It's Global Action Platform. So you'd kind of like to see a bit more global in there. And I think the reason for me why that is so important, I've spent a lot of my career working in Africa and in Asia. I kind of started off originally in the Caribbean, and they had me in little sort of islands with, palm trees and white sand, and I was like, hey, this working internationally is really good. I like it. and then, I'm not sure whether I upset somebody or what, but then they started sending me places where people wanted to shoot me, and kind of, they told me this was because poverty was actually reducing around the world, and now we had fewer fragile and post-conflict states, so that's kind of where you had to go. But I still think I just upset somebody along the way. But I think why that's important is if we look at what happened in the period up to the start of the Sustainable Development Goals, the period of the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, 28 countries failed abysmally, and 26 of those were in sub-Saharan Africa. And there is no evidence whatsoever that that's going to be any different under the SDGs unless we do something different. So perceived wisdom, as John said, the perceived wisdom of what needed to be done didn't work. So getting the experts in the room who generated that perceived wisdom and saying, hey guys, good job, let's go forward, is not necessarily the best way to go. And I like John's idea of actually going more broadly and involving people. But if you're going to do that, I think you need to make sure that you have a really good sample that involves people from around the world, from different countries. And I think one of the things that's particularly important about that, but also very difficult to do, is the Sustainable Development Goals. The critical line in it for me is leave no one behind. That means, by definition, it's the people that are going to be hardest to reach, where there's the least data, where they have the littlest amount of resources themselves and the least ability to actually engage. But those are the people that you need to get involved. So I think we need to actually think again about how we achieve the SDGs, particularly for the fragile and post-conflict states, and particularly the ones in sub-Saharan Africa. And I'll say just one more thing, and then I'll shut up. And why is that so important? It's because if we don't do that, we will fail. If we look at population growth in Africa at the moment, over the life of the MDGs, the population of Africa has gone from round about 500 million to 1 billion, just over. Over the next 30 years, it's going to go to 2.4 billion. Now just think about that in the scale. And a lot of those people are in fragile states. A lot of those people are in landlocked states. They're in countries that are either in conflict or emerging from conflict. They're countries that are actually suffering from climate change, which I know here doesn't exist, but the rest of the world, we kind of think it does. So that's an issue, the climate change, the fragility that we're seeing there. The fact that for every one country that's in conflict, there's a ripple effect in the countries around it, whether that be refugees, whether it be migration, or whether it just be the disruption of trade and the uncertainty which affects the investment climate. So we see all of that happening. So I think we need a focus, not at an aggregate level, but we need to drill into the data and we need to get down to the level really of individual data. So I really would applaud and support John's point.
Very good. Thank you, Trevor. Nicole?
Hi, everyone. Thanks. Thank you, Scott, for inviting me back. It's great to be back in Nashville. I'm Nicole Golden. I work as an independent consultant. I work primarily with international organizations, public sector, private sector, to not only research and analyze and help understand global and local dynamics, but also help translate those into strategies, programs, and policies and initiatives. And so, great tee up. Thanks. Thank you for the report, but also John and Trevor, because I would wholly agree with the idea of engaging a diversity of people. But for me, it also becomes breaking down silos by thinking about not solving for food, solving for health, or solving for prosperity, but solving for people or solving for place. So what do I mean by that? Picking up on what Trevor was saying, whether it's place-based issues around conflict areas, or to pick up on something that Scott mentioned in his introduction about urbanization and thinking differently about cities or rural areas But from a people perspective, one of the issues I deal with and the dynamics that I track and work on are issues around demographics. Not only sort of where people are moving to and where they are, but also who they are. And in particular, issues around populations and aging and what that means. And thinking about aging structures in a lot of these different countries and how that varies and what the implications that has for food, for health, for prosperity. So I'll give an example of young people or youth, which is the population that I've been working most closely with and devising solutions and policies for over the last number of years. Roughly half the world's population is under the age of 30. Roughly a quarter of the world's population, maybe not in this room, but around the world, 1 in 4 people today is between the ages of 15 and 29. Roughly 85% of those people live in low, middle-income countries or fragile states and emerging economies. So when you think about what is driving food, health, and prosperity and those challenges and opportunities, that is a huge issue, right? And when we think about young people, thank you very much. When we think about youth as a people, right, as a cohort, and solving for the issues and challenges they face, it automatically becomes very integrated, right? We know that the lives of young people, as are the lives of really anyone, are very interconnected, right? If you have issues with your health, you may not necessarily be able to go to work, right? So on a very individual level, your health and your prosperity are very much interlinked. If you think about children, if they don't have the right nutrition, they're not able to learn, and their potential opportunities over their lifetime could be impacted, if not stunted. So when you think about solving for people and solving for the differences that different people have, and often that further varies by the place that they are in, kind of geographically, their context and their situation, you inevitably kind of have to think holistically and break it down. So for young people, it's thinking about emerging health risks, which may be different than they were years ago. We've started to get past HIV and AIDS as the most significant issue facing a lot of young people, though it's still obviously a major challenge. But thinking about emerging health risks that are often associated with tobacco, with some of those healthy choices and the behaviors that people face. We can't talk about young people today and prosperity without thinking about education, workforce readiness, and the global youth employment challenge that we're currently seeing. And so how do we think about solutions that can provide opportunity and engage young people in the workforce as workers, as entrepreneurs, as business leaders? So those are just a couple of examples. When you go into food, you can think about, again, the links between food and prosperity. Farming and agriculture, while we have massive urbanization, we still have 70% of the world's workforce roughly in agriculture. And GDP is based in agriculture, yet young people aren't necessarily going into farming. So there's lots of different issues to think about if you want to solve for people or for place versus solving for food, health, and prosperity. And hopefully we can unpack that a little more.
Very good. Thank you, Nicole. Chris?
Okay, Nancy, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm pleased and delighted to be here. What I want to do, if I may, is to spend the next few minutes explaining why one of the principal conclusions of the report on prosperity is wrong. So let me not make any bones about it. There are a number of, how should I say, shortcomings in the report, one of which is glaringly, and I hope to convince you, obviously wrong. So let me briefly explain a little bit about Cargill. Cargill, not many people may know about us because we're private. We're the largest food and agricultural company in the world. We're larger than all our customers. We have $110 billion in turnover. We are on our 7th generation of private owners. So we are one of the traditional large sector companies that are supposedly resistant to embracing some of the conversations we've already had. I've shown there a slide just to give you a bit of a feel for what Cargill does and how it operates. But we have an agricultural supply chain taking crops from areas of surplus to areas of deficit. We are the largest food ingredients business in the world, the largest animal feed business in the world, and the largest protein business in the world. And we've got here not because we are just large, but because we also work in a very traditional and synergistic way with one of the key sectors, our stakeholders, without whom we would not succeed, which is farmers. So our role in life, our purpose in life, frankly, is to be a global leader in nourishing the world in a safe, responsible, sustainable way. Now, what does safe mean? Safety is paramount in Cargill. Every meeting starts with a consideration of safety. We are very focused on the safety of our own 150 employees, but we're also very focused on the safety of people who consume our products. And so many of you in the US will shortly be seeing a major education campaign being led by Costco, the Frozen Food Foundation in Cargill, in time for the holiday season in terms of the importance of food safety in the home. But that is one thing. Another thing, however, is how we operate in our business. Now, we buy crops and livestock from farmers, and we disassemble the individual components into ingredients and bits of animals that get sent down the appropriate food, feed, or industrial channel. And I will just mention in passing that there's not a lot of food waste in the world. What maybe you may regard as waste, animals regard as feed. So it would be nice to have that conversation sometime in a wider meeting. An additional thing is that, as I've explained, our desire is to have a positive impact on the world, to actually make that purpose a reality. So first of all, it's important we work as a partnership. We can't do this alone. We work in partnership with other players in the value chain, our customers, our suppliers. We work in partnership with a number of NGOs. Now, what we're trying to do is to make that purpose a reality, but it so happens that they're completely aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They are, as those of you may know, in number 17. We're involved intimately, like most food and agricultural companies, in 16 of them. Now, today, we're talking principally about 3. And what I want now to do is to talk a little bit about how we deal with some of these things. So we have 3 specific areas. One is food, one is environmental, and one is social, despite the claims of the report. So and I incidentally just mentioned in passing that last Monday I was giving a not dissimilar speech at another conference, and I was joined by 2 very large companies, in this particular case BASF and Chevron. And so I think you can say that the conclusions in the report about wide variety of industry lack of engagement are categorically wrong. So let me give you a couple of examples. We are very focused on food security, and we have a very clear position on food security. The report focuses, in my view, overly strongly on technology and on science and on R&D. The issue of food security is not one, incidentally, of supply. Despite the fact that there are 900 million people who are food insecure, it is the case, if you use the FAO statistics and do the mathematics behind them, that the equivalent in calories is, in terms of their calorie deficient, is 30 million tons of grain. That is a sixth of the amount of grain in the US that's converted into fuels. It's not a supply issue, it's an economic issue. And furthermore, if you consider how the world is going to feed itself with 9 billion people in 30, 35 years, then if you look at the fact that the broadacre crop productivity has doubled of the 16 major broadacre crops in the past 35 years, if you look at the opportunity to bring Africa into the agricultural system, and you look at the strides that have been made in countries like Ethiopia in their productivity, it is not for us an issue of, is there sufficient food to feed the world? The issue is, can we do so in a safe, responsible, sustainable way? So what do those mean? First of all, I've told you a little bit about food security. From our perspective, food security requires focus on policy, not technology issues. And I suspect we'll have a question later on in that, so I won't dwell on that any further. We are very, very focused on farmer livelihoods. We do this, and we get access, as you can see, to more than 10 million farmers across the world. We train them in order to lift their productivity. In the process of lifting their productivity, of course, they become a lot more prosperous. Simple training programs, on average, develop an increase in productivity of at least 30%, in some cases double, in a period of 2 or 3 years. We also focus very strongly, as the report suggests, on innovation. And we innovate in a number of areas. We innovate to help farmers in their livelihoods. We set up co-ops in different countries. We have a system in Ghana where the cocoa farmers are actually paid by mobile phone rather than involve middlemen. We innovate in terms of our value chain and how we transport things around the world. We're the largest bulk shipper of products in the world. We engage only the ships which have passed the Right Ship sustainability program. We innovate in the animal feed space. We are replacing fish meal by fermented products, fermented single-cell protein from methane on the one hand, and a canola crop that embraces healthy omega-3 products on the other. Both done here in the US, both underway and with infrastructure in place. We also innovate particularly in the food ingredient space. So as many of you in the US will be familiar with a natural high-intense sweetener called Truvir, which is an alternative to sugar. We're now on the third generation called Eversweet, which is going to be not only cheaper, but a lot better in taste than the current generations. And so we have a commitment to helping sustain the health, not just here in America where it's going to be launched, but that is a global project. You see there, in terms of eliminating deforestation and advancing climate change. In our particular perspective, that involves land and water use. Productivity improvement and training of existing farmers helps make optimal use of the land. And that doubling of crop productivity I mentioned before was done mostly on existing rather than major uses of land. We're very focused on water use, particularly the quality of water. So we involved here in the US, global perspective, in something called the Midwest Row Cooperative, with a number of other large companies where we're looking to look at growing of corn in Nebraska, in Iowa, in Illinois, and to make it much more environmentally sustainable with precision agriculture, which involves much less runoff into the rivers and through the Mississippi into the dead zone in the Gulf. We are very focused on climate change. Clearly, it's something of an issue. Our chief executive and others have made a very strong commitment to the Paris Accord, and we are in the process of helping farmers accommodate to climate change through different farming techniques. I've mentioned the role of farming and how important it is to train farmers in improving their productivity. So as you can see, we have a lot of activities in this particular space, and I respectfully suggest that I am representative of a large food and agricultural company. They are deeply engaged in the Sustainability Development Goals, but I know from the fact that a lot of our programs involve multiple partners, that almost everybody along the food value chain is similarly inclined, whether it's in the Cocoa Alliance, whether it's in the Rainforest, the Sustainable Rainforest Alliance, whether it's in Responsible Oil Palm Organization. They are multiple companies all working to make the food supply safe, responsible, and sustainable. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Chris. We will further unpack that over the sessions the next few days. Muthoni?
Yeah. Thank you, Nancy. So my name is Modoni Moreu. As you heard, I am a senior director with Oxfam, and I am in charge of the International Programs Department. I have been working in this sector for over 23 years. Oxfam is a global nonprofit that focuses on poverty eradication, dare I say, and we are interested in food security, and we're also very well known for humanitarian response in emergencies and disasters. So the report raised interesting questions and some red flags that have been pointed at, but I think that the panel has quite rightly suggested areas that we can focus on. We are very interested in people-centered solutions across the board. So all the way from talking to people to get the real story, to solutions that are designed around people, whether it is supply chains and their impact on people, the sort of footprint that corporations and companies leave in communities, to health solutions that are designed around people. And what I find particularly interesting about this gathering is that it actually allows for a discussion, bringing in 3 sectors or 3 areas that we think are critical. So you have, of course, governments and their role in governance and regulations. You have citizens and civil society, and you have the private sector. Very often, these 3 are meeting and speaking to each other. And so it's really important to have forums such as this where you mingle. I don't know that Chris and I would be sitting on the same panel in many places. So this is quite unique. And so for that reason, I'm very pleased to be here. We are really concerned about, so the report talks about food and food security, etc. What really concerns us is that in this quest to increase food security, productivity, etc., especially in developing countries, and you heard quite clearly what's happening in many African and least developed countries, that the plight of citizens who may not have the voice and power to speak up will be forgotten. So as we look at increasing agribusiness because of volume, etc., it sometimes is at the cost is creating a new cycle of poverty for populations as they are pushed off land, etc. And I think that perhaps in the next 3 days, as you move to action, it is really critical. It is really critical that you bring those communities into the room, whether it is actually going out to speak to them, but also, the Sustainable Development Goals, the first word is sustainable. And that sustainability will not work if people are not at the center of the design of solutions. And at Oxfam, we like to start from a human rights perspective. So the people and their rights, the rights to a livelihood, the right to shelter, the right to a decent job, is front and center whenever we are discussing any of these issues. And I hope that during the panel, we'll have the opportunity to unpack this a little bit more. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Muthoni. Kathy?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you very much to Scott and the team for inviting me to be here. This is a great discussion. And I'm Kathy Pickus. I started my career in government. I was at the State Department and then moved over to the White House and then had some stints in the not-for-profit world and then ended up in business. So I come to my job with a variety of perspectives. And when you're talking about silos, one of the things that I had reflected on the report was that there are stakeholders that are represented throughout the report, but the value of bringing all of them together and having them as part of a very robust conversation to solve these problems inclusively is something that I see as great promise for the years to come with this endeavor. I also know that none of these factors or none of these stakeholders can solve these problems alone. And it's interesting, I was on a call on Friday with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs that we're looking forward to a conference that they have in the spring. And they said, well, let's just talk about public-private partnerships for a minute. And I said, well, if we're going to get this right, we're going to have to talk about the public-private, private-public. It's not just two sectors engaging to solve this. This is about what's represented on this panel and in this room today, about this diversity of thought that's going to come up with those transformational solutions that really take us to a different place than we are today. And I have to say that if you had invited me to participate in this panel 10 years ago, I would be coming at this from a purely philanthropic perspective. I had been hired by the company to work on its philanthropic programs. And we decided that our philanthropy needed to be more like our business. Every business takes calculated risks every day. And what we wanted to not do was just reinforce old safe solutions. We wanted to wade out into more of the risky areas of how can we disrupt and find new solutions in partnership with others that really can lead to the value on the ground for the communities we're trying to serve. And what we're finding now is that today I don't even do philanthropy. I'm solidly in the corporate space of sustainability, taking the lessons that we learned from that and saying that we can work as a business to work inclusively to come up with some of these new solutions in partnership with others that are respectful of human rights of others, that take into account the needs of the community, but have a lasting impact so that we transform economic opportunity. Because getting back to the silo question, it's not just health, it's not just nutrition, but what is the role of poverty? And how can we, as a private sector, pull to the table with some of our greatest assets that we have, and that's opportunity. And I have to quote a mentor and colleague of mine in this journey that I've taken, Milan Vervier, who was our first ambassador for global women's issues. And she always said that, that potential is universal, but opportunity is not. And that's what we're hoping to bring to that dialogue. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you, Kathy. Claire?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Claire Pomeroy. I am president of the Albert and Mary Lasker Foundation, where we work to increase support for medical research. But I was trained as an HIV physician and spent much of my career watching the unfolding of the AIDS epidemic. And I think there are lessons for us to learn from that about the risk of silos. When I started, there was very little that we could offer to our patients with HIV in terms of medicines and medical interventions. But there was a lot that we needed to do. And we needed to address their housing, their job opportunities, stigma, acceptance in society. And then as we watched the AIDS epidemic unfold, what we saw was great technical solutions that have transformed the outcomes for the rich in developed countries. And we have seen the disease and the epidemic become a disease of the poor and the disenfranchised. This is the risk of silos. For me, what I learned from taking care of those HIV patients was the importance of health actually being discussed in terms of the social determinants of health. And as the report mentions, only 10 to 20% of the state of health of a population is due to clinical care. But take the United States. Where do we spend our money? We spend 2.5 times the average of OECD countries in the United States on clinical care. But here's the interesting part. We spend much less than other countries on social services which address the social determinants of health. And if you add up what we spend in the United States on clinical care plus social services, we spend about the average of OECD countries. It's how we choose to spend our money. So for me, the answer to the question about silos is that you cannot solve any of these things by talking in silos. And so my first suggestion is that when we have conferences and gatherings like this, we not meet in tracks, and we get outside of our tracks and think not the health people talking to the health people and the food people talking to the food people and the prosperity people talking about economics. We all need to talk together. So the first thing that I would say is let us de-silo health, and let us understand that, at least in the United States, zip code is a much more powerful determinant of your health than your genetic code. And we need to understand that if we want to improve health, we're going to have to address socioeconomic status, race, education, job opportunities, food access, safety of neighborhoods, social cohesion. It's been said that people need to make good choices about their health. And in fact, this report has a statement that the future of health is personal behavior and genetics. That's just oversimplified at best. It has been said that people must make good choices. That's the personal responsibility part. But they must have good choices to make. And so if you live in a food desert or a part of the world that doesn't have access to food, then you can't make good choices about what to eat. If you live in a neighborhood that is unsafe, as a mother, you're going to not send your child out to exercise and do physical activity if they're more likely to be shot than address their obesity problem. So I would submit that if we are going to improve health, which is my focus, we have to be talking to each other and we have to be addressing health not in a silo, but we have to be addressing all of the social determinants of health. And that means getting out of our tracks, getting out of our comfort zone, talking to people we don't usually talk to, coming together in non-traditional ways, and hopefully we'll have time to talk about the specific things that we can do. But the one thing that I would advocate, just in case we don't have time for me to get to it, is the concept of health in all policies. This is a long-standing approach in which every policy, whether it's advanced by government or business or whatever, should think about the impact of that decision on health, even if it's not, quote, a health decision. This has long been advocated for by groups like Robert Wood Johnson, et cetera, but it is now becoming quite mainstream. And I come from New York, and Governor Cuomo in January of this year said we will adopt the health in all policies approach. So that gets us out of our silos.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you all for your initial comments as well as valuable insights. So next question up. What innovative solutions do you see as potentially providing scalable, sustainable solutions to feed the planet, enable the health of all, and provide economic opportunity? And what are the major challenges around these solutions? And how do we move to action to overcome these challenges? Mathoni, will you start? And then maybe we can jump in across the panel as people have thoughts.
Sure. So innovation is a funny word. When we talk about it, often people expect a new shiny object. But innovation can just as well be adaptation or adaptation of a solution that's working somewhere else. And that fits in very well with your initial silos question. And one of the things that we've been very conscious of, so we are about 75, almost 80 years old. We work in 80 countries. A lot of our programs are looking at solutions for very marginalized, disadvantaged people. And in the last 10 years, we've began to look outside our normal economic and social analysis for solutions. And we began to look at the private sector and some of the approaches that they have used to deal with large, complex, multi-layered issues. And so we are looking at microinsurance, for example, working with big insurers like Swiss Re. Insurance is a very old, very lucrative profession and industry. And the idea that a farmer who has less than half an acre makes 50 cents might actually be able to buy insurance for his crops doesn't lend himself as a client. That will be the first thought in a big multi-million corporation. However, when we think about risk and de-risking the food system and the fact that when droughts happen and communities find themselves needing food aid or recovery, it costs a lot more. Then the solutions and the approaches that the insurance industry has used for ages actually begins to make sense, but on a micro level. And this means creating products that respond to a very particular type of client, but more importantly, making it economically viable so that the experts, who are the insurance companies, might actually consider these as products that they might want to take on and, to be honest, scale. Because as nonprofit organizations, it's very difficult for us to scale. Mm-hmm. You'll be hearing about some of this tomorrow, a plug for a panel on food security with examples of how we've tried this in Ethiopia. And just last week, we partnered with the World Food Program, and we've managed now to raise, finally, some money to really test it at scale in 5 countries across Africa, so Ethiopia, Senegal, Zambia, Malawi, and one other. The point that I want to make is innovation, yes, sometimes is something new and shiny, but more importantly, when it comes to hunger and responding to large, complex problems, it most certainly is about understanding, so moving out of your comfort zone, looking at the private sector, looking at the health sector, looking at approaches that they've used, and applying them in new ways. So that's part of how we approach innovation.
Good. Thank you. Thoughts, Chris?
Yeah, could I just add a couple of things building on what Tony said? She mentioned earlier that there's a challenge of some of the smallholder farmers in developing economies being driven off their land or losing access to their land and losing their voice. One thing I'd like us to be very clear on that won't scale is going into developing economies and taking the large-scale farming that has evolved especially in the US.
And Asia.
And Asia.
Yeah.
It is crucial that if over the long term, productivity is going to be important because it's going to make more affordable food for everybody. But in the short term, if we adopted the broadacre practices of the United States into bits of Africa, you'd dispossess large portions of the population and you'd have a lot of social instability.
Right.
That means there needs to be some, if you like, balance between lifting the productivity of the smallholders continually without driving off the land and not having the people in the cities suffer the consequences of price. That's a delicate balancing action. It's a delicate position to run. Every country is probably going to do it differently. So the first point is what not to do to scale. What to do to scale, if I can go to the opposite end, is there's an increasing use of much more sophisticated satellite technology to establish how crops are growing and whether there may be a shortfall of a particular crop in one country. If that's the case, then people can start to move before the event actually happens. Now, what is it you can do about that? One key thing that is scalable, as far as we're concerned, and we make no bones about it, we've been very public about it for all our life, and we disagree with any government, any agency that says otherwise, is a trust-based free trade system. We oppose tariffs. We oppose quotas. We oppose any form of restriction of the free movement of food from one sector to another, with the big important exception of the point I've just made for developing economies. Why is that the case? Because if, as Tony said, we have a crop breakdown in one particular area, we need to be, and in many cases, it's not just the developing economies that suffer, it's the developed economies. We need to be able to freely access the products from one part of the world to another. The reality of life is that food is an unpredictable business, so are the crops are unpredictable, and what yield is going to be good in one case is different in another. In particular, the increasing effect of climate change is going to change relatively yields. So from our perspective, having that global free trade is crucial. Let me give you a little factoid to help. 2010, there was a big problem with the Russian wheat crop. Russia, in our view mistakenly, embargoed any exports. That reduced the global supply of wheat by 0.7%. The price of wheat went up 70%. It was a major factor, especially in Egypt, in the Middle East spring. Global free trade in food is essential. There are other things that Matoni's mentioned, and I would go beyond her story about insurance and microfinance. I would expand it to include access to training, access to fertilizer, and most important of all, access to a market. There's no point in increasing farmer productivity if their products just sit and rot on the road or in the field because they can't get to market. Not just a local market, but increasingly a global market.
Trevor and then Claire.
Yeah. So what underpins all of that is data and knowledge. Yeah. If you don't know what you're doing and you don't know what the gaps are and you don't know how it affects different communities, the chances of you making the right decisions are pretty limited. If we look at, again, and I mean going backwards to go forwards, if we look at how the Millennium Development Goals were achieved, right? I mean, all the development agencies will say we did a fantastic job and all this sort of thing. I'm not entirely sure I totally buy it. I think it was important, but really, the biggest reason we hit most of the MDGs is because of massive growth in China and India. Dirty growth in the main, using fossil fuels, massive levels of pollution, major sort of environmental issues. If we look at Africa and we look at, say, somewhere like Nigeria, which went over that period to be the fastest growing economy in Africa and now the largest economy in Africa. Over the same period of time, the number of people living in Nigeria went from 45 million to 112 million. Yeah? So poverty went from 40% to 65% while they moved to the highest GDP. So what we need to do is we need to make sure we've got good quality data to underpin our decisions. We need to understand the impact of them, and we need to make sure that any growth that we get is actually much more equitable growth, because you mentioned the Arab Spring, right? What we're seeing now is we're seeing massive population growth taking place across the south, mainly in Africa. It was in India, was in Asia, but increasingly in Africa. We've seen a refugee crisis coming out of conflict. We've seen all the issues that go with that. We've seen famine in the Horn of Africa. Those people are not going to stay at home. We have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and it is an opportunity. If you think of it from a business point of view, we've got the situation in Africa right now where we've got massive population growth taking place over the next 25 years. Today, only about 300 million people have access to power. We're talking about needing to grow a power industry which can supply power to 2.4 billion people in the next 30 years. Just think of the size of that challenge in America. Here, you've got about 300 million people. You've got power for everybody. Just think about taking that and multiplying it by a factor of 8 across 54 countries, 28 of them either in conflict or emerging from conflict, many of them landlocked. Just think about the challenge of doing that. But the business opportunity there in terms of power and in terms of clean power. Think about the opportunity in terms of urbanization, as Scott mentioned earlier. Globally, we see about 75% of the population living in cities. In Africa, that's likely to go to about 65%. Well, what does that mean? That means the equivalent, the need to build cities, sustainable cities, green cities, whatever you want to call them, cities that actually engage the population rather than some of the concrete monstrosities we've seen in the past, yeah? Living cities that don't cause social problems, but actually help to integrate people, yeah? We need to build cities, the equivalent of 140 New Yorks in Africa in the next 30 years to cope with that. Now just think of that as a business opportunity. That's potentially $12 trillion of opportunity there, just in those two sectors. So not only is this a massive challenge for business, it's a massive opportunity as well. But as was mentioned, we need finance, we need innovative finance, we need new ways of accessing capital. But will we be able to access capital if there's not a trainable workforce? And at the moment, we've got major problems due to disease, due to stunting, et cetera, which we need to tackle. We've got the whole issue of how we retrain people, so the sort of lifelong learning issue. and the importance of that for the academic community and how we draw on that. And that was something else which I felt was understated in the report. And it links back to what Nicole was saying about being much more people-centered. You know, yes, we can see what we need to do from a technology point of view, from a finance point of view, from an innovation point of view, but we've got to have the will to do it, and we've got to have the will to mobilize that at scale.
Very good. Claire, I think had some thoughts. Thank you, Trevor.
So I'd like to pick up on that to address this question of opportunities for innovation and go back to the earlier point about the risk of leaders thinking that they know the opportunities. I think that two areas that were really absent in the report and are potential subjects of discussion over the next couple of days are innovation in education of the workforce that's going to find the answers to these questions, and innovation in the research ecosystems that are going to ask the questions and find the solutions. So just from a health education point of view, we now understand that we actually trained healthcare providers in silos, and for the most part still do. And we understand now that interprofessional, so doctors and nurses need to work together as teams if we're really going to have solutions. But it goes beyond that. So now we have law students working with medical students to learn how to address patients' medical legal problems. These are new models that I think could be very much put into the reports that come out of this. The next question is the opportunity for innovative approaches to research. And there are many important questions in health that there really are no funding sources for. And you know, the government and academia have certain approaches, business has certain approaches, but there are a lot of other questions. And so just, you know, one to throw out there is this fascinating finding that there's a big increase in deaths of despair among the middle-class white Americans, a group that we thought was immune from the social, quote, social determinants of health. And yet we don't know very much about the etiology of that, and we certainly don't know very much about the potential interventions. So we can spend a lot of time congratulating ourselves that we've asked good research questions about cardiovascular disease and cancer, but we haven't asked a whole lot of questions of how can you intervene for things like socioeconomic status, poverty, et cetera, to improve health. So I think the reports need to address opportunities for innovation, both in educating the workforce that will answer these questions and the way that we gather data, research, and evidence around these questions.
Very good. Thank you, Claire. Any other thoughts from the panel on innovation before we keep moving?
Just very quickly, just to pick up on a couple other points. Leading off on the data, completely agree. And just one sort of follow-on is thinking about the transformational power of big data. Mentioned the idea of satellite data and how that's changing the agricultural field, and it's really applying in so many different ways. I've been working, like I mentioned, a lot on youth employment and youth entrepreneurship, where young would-be entrepreneurs face more acute sort of financing and credit risks or credit failures than anyone else, right? They don't necessarily have collateral, they're a big risk. And especially in lower income economies, developing markets where data is really poor, they're really considered a bigger risk and often left out, financially excluded, if you will. So we're seeing how big data is coming in and different kinds of data sources are being used to create credit histories and open up financing for young entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs, so that they can start a business, get themselves into value chains or supply chains, and start growing their businesses that way. So that's just another example of the importance of big data. When we think about, Trevor, talked about these massive movements of humanity, whether it's forced displacement, voluntary migration, and often it comes down to having your credentials, your identity, whether that's in a blockchain or in other kinds of uses of data so that you can prove who you are, again, whether it's for credit history, for proving your education and skills, to get a job at your destination. So the use of, I think, of data is worth kind of reinforcing the transformational application of that. And then just quickly on process innovation, I think we also can think about some of the innovations we're seeing in terms of financing and getting even beyond what some of the larger public donors are thinking about in terms of how they're financing innovatively using credit or what have you, but also looking at private sector, the impact investing space, using social impact bonds or development impact bonds. But also even getting beyond that and thinking about the role of everyday citizens, right? Whether it's crowdfunding, crowdsourcing, or even just, this was mentioned earlier, the way that individuals today are kind of more conscious consumers. And so I think just the whole space around financing, there's a lot of space for innovation and a lot, especially combined with technology and the use of big data, to really be transformational across the space.
Very good. Thank you, Nicole.
Can I be really bad and have another go?
Of course.
I apologize to the rest of the panel. I promise I'll be good for the rest of it. But let me just ask you a question, right? So the SDGs, we heard there's 17 of them. There's 260-odd targets, right? What do you reckon? How many of those do the data exist for at the moment? We've just talked about the importance of data. We've talked about much more personalized decision making, about making sure we leave no one behind. What do you reckon? How many of the data exists to cover what sort of number? I know you know.
None.
Yeah?
Any thoughts from the audience? No, I don't know.
Not enough. There is no systematic data for over 2/3 of the SDGs at this point in time. Just doesn't exist. Yeah? And just a simple one, a really simple one. We're talking about massive population growth, right? 44% of countries worthwhile don't have any systematic, really bad systematic system in place to register births, deaths. Yeah. 44% of the countries in the world, yeah? So it's great to say we need to use data, and it's great to say we need better quality data, but by God, we've got a long way to go just to get some of the basics right. I mean, a lot of the clever stuff we want to do with the data, as you all know, you put rubbish in, you get rubbish out. So we also need, in addition to doing all the clever stuff and the satellites and all the stuff like that, we really need to focus on getting some of the basics right as well. It's, yeah.
We got an applause on that one. Excellent. Good. Thank you, Trevor. John, if you would cover, from a metrics standpoint, what metrics do we need to think about to help measure and guide the whole progress towards these solutions? If you would start on that, and maybe we'll get some other thoughts from the panel.
Yeah, thank you for asking me that particular question. You know, with this group of leaders, I think one pop quiz might be interesting would be what is the single biggest issue facing the world? But think about it, because if you don't know the answer to that question, how can you help the world? We went and asked the world, by the way, what they want in 150 countries. Before I tell you the answer, I'll just give you a quick story. I was in an African country a few weeks ago, and we did a massive survey there. And we asked people, rate your life on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is the worst possible life and 10 is the best possible life. Where do you stand today? Think about that question for yourself, by the way. Many of you in here might say a 7 or an 8. Many of you might say a 10. In this particular African country, on average, they gave their lives a 4. It's not good. So we asked them another series of questions. By the way, in terms of the 3 things that we ask here today, hunger runs rampant throughout this African country. Second thing, in terms of health, we ask them point blank about their health. Let me tell you, it's not good. And then issues of prosperity, we don't even need to start there because they have so many issues facing their lives. We asked them one question, though. What would make you rate your life higher? You know what most all of them said? A job. To have a good job. It's not just true of that one country. It's true of all countries around the planet. So when we're thinking about a context of data, one of the things we want, and I know I'm echoing your comments, Trevor, is we need to get our premises right. And the premise right now in terms of what the world wants. Yes, 1 billion people are hungry. Yes, 1 billion people are illiterate. Yes, 1 billion people do not have access to clean drinking water. But the billions of people that we talk to say they want a great job. So for this leadership group, when you guys are thinking of policies, when you're thinking about programs, put jobs first.
But just to pick up on something that came up earlier is what's, again, interesting is how much of these other factors go into getting a job, staying in a job, and being successful in that job. And I think that's what's really interesting about the work that you do and asking people, about what they think and what they feel and how that relates to the broader set of solutions in order to get them that job.
Good. Other thoughts? Tani, Kathy?
Yeah, I think those are really important questions because for each one of them, the answer is nuanced, right? You get the straight answer, but if you dig deeper, people talk about the quality of the job. It's not just any job. It's a decent job. People are interested in being able to feed themselves, their families, and shelter. And they are interested in those jobs being sustainable. One of the questions that was asked in the report, one of the things in the report was about agriculture and the fact that agriculture needed to be economically rentable in order to get a different generation to take up the production of food. And we just talked about the growth of cities. And we're thinking that as we think about the current generation, especially in developing countries, that maybe we need, one, to have a different audience in the room that may be thinking about what's going to happen in 20 years' time, the future of work. Maybe this isn't the right mix of people to talk about what work will look like. And maybe we should be asking a generation that is not at this meeting. Oh, maybe they are. I saw a track for young people. But in the countries where we ask these questions, John, I'm curious about what somebody who is 15 or 18 would respond in contrast to what their parents might be saying in terms of what is that job. I do believe very strongly that what I started off by saying that the focus on people-centered design and solutions and answers is critical. And I want to talk about a statistic that was just given about the youth bubble as it's being talked about, especially on the African continent, where almost about 70% of the population is between 15 and 30. It's being seen as a problem, but I think that there's a huge dividend if we consider that the rest of the world, Europe, OECD countries are aging. So again, if you think generationally, and you have aging populations that are actually not renewing themselves, there are a few interventions that would actually make that a plus in 10, 20 years' time. Whether you're talking about whatever industry you're talking about, it can be a plus. And my strong feeling is that everything we talk about, data is political. There is a reason why some countries aren't counting deaths and births. Why a census, even here in the United States, it's very sensitive, it's very political. And some of the solutions that we're talking about, yes, it might be economic, it might be social, it might be health, but there's a point that where when the HIV issue became a national health crisis and became political, then the conversation changed. And so for that reason, I would say yes, data is important. I would suggest that because of some of the statistics that have been put out here, that we need a different mix of, even here with the hub, you need to bring in a different mix of voices. Because otherwise I'm not suggesting that this is not a super smart group, but just the language and the way we look at things is slightly different. My nephew is 18. He lives in Kenya. He fully does not expect to be employed. He imagines that he will have to figure out how to make a living and start a business of some sort or the other, but he has to rely on himself because the picture that he sees has been one of constantly no jobs, and they expect that if you want to make a living, you'll have to make your own. So the question is, what is the enabling environment for that is created in order for that to happen, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in tech. Some of the fastest growing tech hubs are actually on the African continent. One is in Kenya. And so as we talk about global solutions, and it's all connected, let's think slightly differently because we are in a different age and a different era, and maybe we need slightly different opinions than the ones that are presently in the room, with all due respect.
Very good. Nicole?
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on that, Bob snaps, whatever.
I got to hear on that.
As I said, a lot of the work I do has been looking with young people, for young people, by young people. Several years ago, I was involved in the creation at CSIS of the first Global Youth Wellbeing Index. And to reiterate sort of John's point, one of the really interesting things when we were building that index of 40 indicators, looking at the lives of young people in both lower and high-income countries, we looked at 30 countries. This was in 2014. And one thing that was really important was that we brought in what we would call not only observed indicators, so youth employment rate or HIV rate, but also perception-based indicators. So how do young people think and feel about their situation? And what was interesting is that those things don't often align, or there is frequently a disparity. And we know young people, for example, make decisions around in a different way, right? They're very short-term and tend to be short-term in nature, tend to be very peer-based in terms of comparative and in the way that they think about their status and the way they make decisions. So understanding what they're thinking is really critical and what they want and the perceptions, the barriers they face. So when you talk about youth and agriculture as a good example, a lot of the reason young people aren't going into agriculture is they don't have access to land. And whether it gets back to the governance point, whether it's an inheritance issue or other barriers in obtaining and owning land that is preventing them from wanting to go into agriculture, even though that's actually paradoxically where arguably a lot of the opportunity, particularly in the Africas of the world, may be. Private sector is not necessarily generating enough jobs to absorb the young people. We've heard this before. We talk about the demographic dividend and the opportunity that's presented. Many of you, I'm sure in the room, are familiar with the East Asian Miracle, the rapid economic growth across parts of East Asia, the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Well, as much of a third, some economists attribute of that growth is to the fact that at the time they had this youthful population that they invested in education, they got into jobs, they were very productive, it produced not only a sort of productivity gain, but a consumer gain, lots of people spending the economy, and that was this demographic dividend. Now, whether Africa, with its still growing youth population, or parts of South Asia with its still growing youth population can see that dividend is the big question, is the kind of elusive question. But we need to think about better marrying supply and demand. I mean, as an economist, I love hearing you talk about that it's not just about the supply question. Supply and demand applies to everything. I often talk about it in education. Claire, you talked about the fact that we are not necessarily educating children and young people with the right skills because we're not necessarily engaging the private sector enough. 65% of children today, born today, will be in jobs that don't exist yet. So how can we train for those jobs? So it's really thinking differently about marrying supply and demand, whether that's in what are the skills people need to have, whether it's about how do you get food to where it's needed, and thinking about things in a different way.
Very good. Thank you, Nicole. Let's pivot to what is the role of governance, either from a government standpoint, policy, all around governance. Chris, do you want to kick us off on that one?
Well, thank you, Nancy. So I raised this originally. I've already touched on some of the aspects of it in terms of food security. I've already suggested that a trust-based free trade in foodstuffs is important to help alleviate hunger. When Russia put the embargo on wheat, the country worst affected was Egypt, and we, Cargill, essentially replaced the shortfall, but nevertheless, because the price had gone up, it was a significant cost to the Egyptian economy. A second factor, as far as we're concerned in food security, is the issue of what we call comparative advantage. There are some countries which are blessed with a particular soil, a particular climate, and particular infrastructure which make them suited to a particular foodstuff. And if you think of growing bananas in the Caribbean and in Central America and South America, you think of the ability of where we sit here in Nashville, for instance, and going further south for cotton. You think of the Midwest in terms of the row crops like soy and corn. The most striking exception, I think, is to say, so I live in Minneapolis. Minneapolis is the coldest large city in North America. And in the depths of winter, the ice is about a meter thick, and it's minus 30 degrees centigrade. If we wanted to, we could grow bananas. Not very economically sustainable. So you have to do things which are sustainable, where your climate is appropriate and your water supply is appropriate. In Saudi Arabia, until recently, they used to get their wheat supply, because of their desire to be food independent, from irrigated fields. It took up 85% of their water. They stopped it because it started depleting the aquifer. They're now imported. But the aquifer now has a lifetime that's 9 times what it was before. A third element from our particular perspective, and probably the most crucial element that's been touched on and is rather vague in the report, if we're talking about the key to bringing in, and we've heard from a number of speakers, what's happening in the demographics of the developing world, smallholders play a key role in that. The key thing in helping smallholders become more productive is a price. They need to be able to get an attractive price for the produce they make. To do that, they need a number of factors. We've already discussed the whole issues associated with they need land ownership. Otherwise, they won't invest because they're not sure of the return. They can be displaced at any time. But they also need the infrastructure around them to help them succeed. A fourth thing from our particular perspective is we need to make sure that in this system, this food system of ours, that we give people a feeling of security. That, for instance, an inappropriate system is not suddenly going to be introduced somewhere in the world that's going to make them uncompetitive and displace them from the land. So our particular concern is that we work on what are important policy decisions. It is too tempting to work on saying, well, we need this technology or that technology. Technology is important. Seed's important. Finance is important. Fertilizer is important. But the key thing is price. And for that, smallholders need security of tenure with access to all of those, but also the feeling that they can access to a market. So the fourth thing is a matter of all the infrastructure, not just around the farm, but also the roads and the ports that are needed to take crops from where they're grown as a surplus to where they're needed as a deficit. So in our perspective, one of the shortcomings of the current report is it doesn't put a focus on, A, the economic motivation for smallholders in particular to lift their productivity, and B, the importance of all the other factors I've just raised in terms of food security.
Good. Kathy, any thoughts? And then Claire?
Yeah, just building on the comments about the ecosystem that was reflected in the report. They got that right. And the complexity of this ecosystem is kind of showing through right now. But, thinking of, when Chris was talking about, how Cargill goes into these markets, gone are the day when any business just thinks about manufacturing something in one place, sending it to another place. They're thinking holistically about value chains and inclusive value chains. And it's not just about delivering that product, but what do you need to ensure that the right kind of tactics are being deployed to make sure that the farming is efficient as well as effective. And the jobs that you were talking about in Africa that exist today in agriculture might not be the ones that are going to be appealing to this next generation, but it's our job to kind of reset the stage so that they have the right kind of jobs, that they're paid equitably, and that the ecosystems are created so that they're more efficient. So it's a complex but positive narrative about what can be done collectively.
Very good. Claire, thoughts?
One area around governance and governments that I thought was underemphasized in the report was the need for really global collaborative efforts to address issues. And, from a health perspective, when I think about this, and I think about pandemics, they don't pay attention, bugs don't pay attention to borders, right? And I think about antimicrobial resistance and practices in one country are going to impact globally. And I personally have great concern that at least the United States, as we have sort of threatened to opt out of global cooperative agreements that are attempting to address some of these issues, is a real threat to the goals that we have. So I think this report is an opportunity for us to say, the global approach to addressing antimicrobial resistance, for example, is essential. There are entities like the World Health Organization, the UN, that we're withdrawing funding from, and we have an exploding epidemic of extremely drug-resistant tuberculosis around the globe, and that will, be in our communities as well, of course. So let's talk about that. Now, certainly this isn't just governments. It's also NGOs. And, probably one of the success stories is Gavi. And one of the success stories is the Gates Foundation funding of vaccinations around the world, one of the most effective interventions that we can do for health. We should be talking about expanding those, not contracting them, and applying them to more situations, more challenges, I believe. So I'd love to see that come out in the report in stronger actions when we get to the action plan later on
Good.
Tuesday.
Very good. Good thoughts. John, maybe any other global trends that you've seen that should be taken into account as we move into tomorrow?
Well, you asked specifically about government, so maybe I can be helpful with just some of the data that we've stared at. One major thing about governments is whether or not they are listening to people, whether or not it's being perceived that they're listening to people. I'll give you an example. Here in the United States, back in 2008, single biggest issue, when we asked people, what's the biggest issue facing America today? Do you know what they said? 2008, crisis, jobs in the economy. It was the single biggest issue. We asked again in 2009, same thing, 10, 11, 12, same thing for 6 straight years. Now, some might argue that wasn't entirely the sole focus of what Washington was doing. And by the way, Congress's approval ratings have now completely bottomed out. They're at a point where they're seriously not funny anymore. But after 6 years of what was perceived as not being listened to or dealing with some of the major issues facing the country, guess what Americans said was the single biggest problem facing the country today? the government. So it switched. In fact, when we do our global surveys, we ask people in all countries around the world whether or not they think corruption is widespread in their governments. Guess what it is today in the United States? 75% say that corruption is widespread in the U.S. government. Now, you might say, well, come on, John. That's just got to be true in America all the time, or it's at least true in kind of all governments. People just kind of think governments are corrupt. Not so. In fact, 9 years ago, when we first did it, only a slight majority said that they thought corruption was widespread in the U.S. And then put those graphs against Germany's. About 59% of people said corruption was widespread 10 years ago in Germany. Guess where it is today? 30%. You know, Merkel actually won Time Person of the Year about 2 years ago. That data would point to a good reason why she should have won it. So I think those are some things that people should be considerate of when thinking about government, whether or not they are listening and the perception of whether or not that they're listening.
Very good. Thank you, John. Any other thoughts?
One thought I'd just pick up. I mean, most of us, I think, from developed economies are aware of the increasing trend, especially an age-related trend, into having food that is composed of ingredients that they understand, they're familiar with from their kitchens. They would like to know how these ingredients or these foods are actually manufactured and made, which farms they were sourced from. That's an increasing trend. It's also important, however, to stress that this is not an exclusively developed economy concern. It's also a developing economy concern. And some of the concerns that we have here in the developed economies, for instance, the issues of diabetes, the issues of sugar, we're seeing these health problems emerge in big time in some of the less developed economies, India, in particular with things like diabetes. It is crucial that when we talk about feeding the world, we talk about feeding the world not just with safe food, but also with nutritious food. And nutritious food means we need to mitigate the impact of these non-communicable diseases around the world, many of which are ascribable to an unbalanced diet. Now, I need to make an extreme play as someone who has to do this day in, day out, every day of the week, every week of the year. There is no such thing as a healthy food. There is no such thing as a healthy ingredient. There's not even a healthy diet. There is a healthy lifestyle, and that lifestyle involves physical activity and involves a diet. And what is healthy for one person is not necessarily healthy for another, even with the same sort of lifestyle. It is highly complex. It's unlikely to be resolved in my lifetime. I have my doubts that it's going to be resolved in many of us, many other lifetimes either. But nevertheless, we do know certain things. One of the key things we need to avoid is an unbalanced diet that is not a broad variety of fresh and, if necessary, processed foods eaten in moderation, in balance, in conjunction with a healthy lifestyle. Because we do not want the history of the developed economies here in the West to migrate to the developing economies in Africa, in South America, and into Asia.
Very good. Good. Trevor?
Yeah. I've spent quite a lot of my career working at the heart of government in the Caribbean, Latin America, Africa, India, and other countries. In a number of countries, working as an advisor to the Prime Minister or the President of the country. And, you know, there are always multiple demands on people's time. There are always multiple demands on resources. And it's not always the technically right solution that gets the focus. It's the one that shouts the loudest. It's got the one that's got the most active constituent. It's the one that's got the best political connections and the best political influence. And I think when we look at the SDGs, I don't think we can see it just as a technocratic solution. We have to look at it in the real world, in the political world. And one of the things that's a big concern for me about the SDGs is paying for them. And I think if you look at it, and it goes right back to the beginning, there was a complete separation between creating the SDGs, which took place mainly in New York, and the funding discussion, which was in Addis. Complete separation. And if you look at that and you look at it in your own life and you say, okay, so the governments get together in the UN, they sit down, they agree these goals, and they look at them and they say, okay, it's going to cost about $2.5 trillion to $3.5 trillion. They're big numbers. Depends who you talk to, but it's somewhere in that $2.5 to $3.5 trillion range, yeah, per annum between now and 2030. That's fine. So what are governments putting into that, yeah? Well, last year, official development assistance, total for the whole world, 146 billion. Yeah? That's all. So where's the rest going to come from? It's going to come from domestic resource mobilization. Well, to you and me, that's tax. So is that credible? I mean, look at the US. You're talking about what? $1.5 trillion of tax cuts? And that's the largest economy at the moment, yeah? You look in the UK, we've got all the issues around Brexit. We look at what's happening across Europe. We look at Africa at the moment with a lot of the instability and the uncertainty that's taking place there. There's not real evidence that there's going to be significant increases in tax take, and there's not the indication that there's a political will to do that. So where does that leave us then? It leaves us in a situation where people are looking increasingly to the private sector and saying the private sector needs to step up because there's a business opportunity here. And that's true, there's no question about that. But I think we all need to think about this. And I talked earlier about will. Yeah. And you know, you were saying about data's one thing, why is the data not there? It's because there's an absence of will. And that's absolutely right. But the only time we get political will is when we put pressure. Now, whether that's through NGOs, whether that's through business leaders, whether that's through communities. But if we want to achieve the SDGs, it's not just a technical solution, it's also a political solution and an advocacy solution as well, I believe.
And if I may, just build on that. And one of the key things there, you're absolutely right, and you've mentioned all the challenges of energy. Energy is priced, however. Now, it varies in price from country to country. The sixth of the Sustainable Development Goals is water and hygiene. Water is not priced, except in a few states in Australia. Until we price water, we cannot mobilize the resources you're talking about because there is no incentive to use it. People will not save water if it's almost free. Even in the agricultural world, if we do not price water effectively, and water rights are essentially given away or there's some sort of political deal, we're not going to improve it. The reality of life is we need to give economic motivation to help do some of these things. Now, is there going to be a carbon tax? I don't know. So what you're really talking about, to some extent, is pricing what are currently either unpriced or only partially priced externalities. If we want to make these changes, then that is the way we're going to motivate it. As you correctly said, you're not going to get the government taxing more people. There's going to be a big challenge there. You're going to get pushback from people being asked to do these things as a matter of moral suasion. There has to be a motivation behind that. Water in particular, what is the difference in price between desalinated water and rainwater and water in a reservoir versus water in a river? Until we start to get a proper systematic approach to pricing some of these things which previously have been regarded as free or as a right, and remember we did it with fresh air when we introduced the measures on acid rain, we're not going to get the sort of progress you need to do in a number of these sustainable development goals.
Just to pick up on that, I mean, going back to the idea of scalable, transformative, innovative solutions and the challenges and opportunities, I think this is where governance and government, and there is a difference often between the two in policy, can be both, right? And when you think about the systems opportunity and the sort of public provision that government can provide, there is opportunity to reach scale with change. So again, I'll go back to education as an example. And you think about how when curriculums are upgraded, reformed, or revised, taking better into account not only the way that teachers teach, but what they're actually teaching, you can see scalable improvement in learning outcomes for young people that hopefully could translate into better employment and economic opportunities. So that's an example of where there is real opportunity in systems and in governance, or leveraging, bringing different partners together in governance to leverage resources. So there's opportunities. But wholeheartedly agree with what Trevor was saying. The challenge is that political will. And I think a challenge in governance is who's making those decisions and those people that are in the room. And how that then ultimately impacts the direction of the resources or the policies or the systems that they are developing and implementing, and who's benefiting, and whether there is equality of benefit. So whether it's, you think about legislative practices, you talk about sort of, presidents and executives, but legislatures are often a good sort of measure that you can look at across countries. So, again, use the representing young people's views. So we talked about, the half the world's population under the age of 30. Anyone want to take a stab at the average age of a parliamentarian worldwide? Average age of a parliamentarian?
60.
Close. 55.
55.
55. Anyone want to take a guess at the percentage of parliamentarians in their 20s?
5.
1.
It's 2. 2 at the last study a couple years ago. In their 30s, 12. Now, there's lots of reasons for this, right? Whether it's age thresholds or what have you. When we look at measures of gender parity and gender equality, often one of those measures is looking at the role of, or the representativeness of women, not only in political power, whether that's in a legislature, in an executive, in a cabinet, but also in the corporate side, and women in power, and women in leadership. And the fact that when they are not in those leadership positions or have that input into the decision-making process, you are less likely to see those policies, those systems, that governance be one that sort of benefits. So I think it's a really great point about political will, but I think we also really need to get back to who's in the room and really understand the implications of not necessarily having the most representative governance structures, whether that's in the public or the private sector.
Very good. Thank you.
And can I just add one thing to the political will? And it's something that, as Oxfam, we are focusing on, and this is the issue of inequality. So we put out an inequality report about 2 years ago at Davos that showed that, I think, 6 men own most of the world's wealth, but that's not the problem. It is a problem, but it's not the only problem. The big issue is who's going to care about the inequality. And this is, I personally, and when we look at power and power differentials, we think that this is the role of governments. It is the role of governments to create a fairly equal playing field for citizens to enjoy their rights and to develop to their full potential. And the issue of inequality actually cuts across, it's a great silo breaker. It cuts across all of the issues that we've been talking about. And it is about political will. It is about caring that there are people who, look at the United States, have felt left out because the equality between the haves and the have-nots is growing so huge. It decides, who eats and who doesn't eat, what sort of food you eat, whether you go to school, whether even in an existing health system you get good health care. And what I would, I'm not able to stay for the next 2 days, but when looking at the program, what I would hope is that in the next 2 days, there will be discussion about transferring knowledge, skills, possibilities of new markets, new businesses, but that in the midst of that, I go back to what I said at the beginning, that this is all not just people-centered, but that we are thinking about the outcomes of whatever project you're going to be discussing where it lands, the impact on people, and that at the end of the day, some of the issues that we're so scared of, that we worry about and we fear, are actually a function of huge inequalities. So if everybody has a decent job, if everybody has decent housing, if there's lighting on the streets, you have less insecurity, for example. I mean, that's just a really basic example. And so bringing inequality, foreign as it might sound, into discussions in a space like this is really important from a rights perspective. And I would hope that in the next 2 days, it finds its way into your discussions, debates, deliberations, and that it features prominently in your actions.
Very good. Thank you. Claire?
I'd like to join in applauding the comments about inequality and then remind us that as we seek solutions to inequality, one of the, I think, missteps that is often made is that it's about delivering equal things. And solutions are not about equality. Solutions are about equity. And equity means giving people what they need. So some people may get more than others. And somehow we've twisted the inequality situation into a discussion of the solutions are unequal. Look at the U.S. discussions about tax breaks right now, when really we should be talking about the equity of the solution to address inequality.
And I was just picking up on what John said earlier, not only about what equity and need, but equity and what people want for themselves, and not taking that out of the equation. And also going back to the point about data, that if we need to think about measuring inequality and making sure that we're understanding where there are inequalities or inequities, we get back to the data challenge. Because even where we have a lot of good data, it's not necessarily disaggregated within a population. So you may or may not know where men versus women fare on any given data point. You may or may not know where a 20-year-old fares versus a 50-year-old on any given data point. You may, but more likely you may not. And again, to this point about understanding and addressing inequality or inequity, it comes back to me often to the data.
You're good.
Just absolutely right. And I agree with the point about it's the government's responsibility, but very often government fails. And I don't think we can wait. I mean, we're doing a lot of work at the moment. We've partnered with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Plan International, Women Deliver, and Data2X, who actually set something up called Equal Measures. And basically what that does is it looks at how women and girls are affected by the SDGs. And the idea is to actually capture a mix of public sector, private sector, and not-for-profit data to actually bring it together to get a richer picture. And the reason we're doing that is because governments are not capturing that data. So we're trying to push that into the debate, partly to try and persuade governments that it's something they should be doing. They should be improving their own statistical capacity at a country level, but also to actually try and provide some data to actually take forward that debate. And the second thing I'd just sort of flag is we also produce something called the Change Readiness Index, which it is designed to help governments and businesses actually look at different countries and look at where they start from. Because one of the things we've not really talked about very much here is that every country starts from a different place, whether it be sort of economic or social or environmental. You mentioned that certain countries have different advantages and disadvantages. And it's understanding that, because there isn't one solution that fits everybody. So every country really needs to find their own way. And it's how you actually build that mix of alliances and partnerships across different sectors to actually address those gaps, I think, that's important. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. Any thoughts or questions from the audience before we break for our reception? Anything that's come to mind that you wanted to ask the panel about today? No questions? Okay, well, we'll have time during our reception as well as at dinner time. So first of all, I'd like to thank our panel for so many... such fabulous insights and really set the stage for the next day and a half. So, we're really excited about the next day and a half. As Scott mentioned earlier, we want to move towards action, which is really, coming up with actionable, from committees to teams to tasks to do. So, and also like to challenge you, as a couple of the panelists mentioned, don't stay in your comfort zone. Get outside your comfort zone the next day and a half. Go to tracks that are, something that maybe you don't work on a day-to-day basis, because we really want to break those silos down. And it's a team effort across food, health, and prosperity. So thank you for your time.
As you're leaving, I'll just also add my thanks to Nancy and the panel for this detailed and robust engagement around the issues. One of the things that I heard from some of the discussions, although there's so many complex issues that are going to have to be balanced in any kind of set of solutions, is the need increasingly for effective solutions to be localized. And we're going to be talking some more in the program coming up about the importance of what Bruce Katz calls the new localism, and how in local settings we need to re-knit the shared experiences and knowledge of experts and leaders with everybody else in the community, and how we also re-knit the destinies, the prosperity, the economic opportunity, the health, the nutrition, those destinies of those who are typically leaders and experts have come to diverge from the rest of the community. We're going to have to re-knit those things and re-knit them at a local level to build the trust and the capacity for collaboration to actually address these problems in tangible, realistic ways. So, again, thank you all for helping us think about this much more deeply. We look forward to talking with you tomorrow. Thank you.